Welcome everybody to Raising Multilinguals Live. My name is Tetsu Young from Ask Tetsu.
And my name is Rita Rosenbach from multilingualparenting.com. Welcome.
And my name is Multilingua from Ute's International Lounge. Welcome, everyone. And we are very honored to have Professor Janice Nakamura as Associate Professor at Kanagawa University, Japan, as our guest today. She researches child bilingualism within the Japanese context and works closely with intercultural families. She grew up in multilingual in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and increased her linguistic repertoire, I hope I get all the languages, of English, Hakka, Cantonese, Mandarin, and Malay to Japanese when she moved to Japan in 2002. She tries to uncover linguistic and non-linguistic barriers to family bilingualism by investigating parent-child interaction and family language policy. So she draws attention to the importance of fostering bilingualism in the home through her research on receptive child bilingualism and monolingual mixed ethnic children's lost opportunity for minority language acquisition. Now, receptive bilinguals are those who, for example, understand two languages but only speak one. I imagine we can also adopt the same term for those who speak two or more languages and understand only one or less than all of them. But please, let's start with our children. Is it usual for bilingual children to become receptive bilinguals, that's to say, to be able to understand but not speak one of their languages?
Yes, thank you for the introduction. And to answer your first question, it is actually very usual for children to hear two languages but only speak one of them. And it is very common. And in fact, Professor Annick de Houwer has actually summarized a few survey studies in several parts of the world, including Australia, Canada, Europe, and Japan. And on average, 1 out of 4 children are actually receptive bilinguals. So it is actually a very common phenomenon.
And you have done quite some research about receptive bilingualism. Are there early receptive bilinguals?
Yes, they are, but I would be a little bit careful about classifying very young bilingual children as receptive bilingual children, simply because in the first 3 years of life, the development of the two languages is just very unpredictable. In fact, it is actually very common for one language to be developing faster, much faster than the other one. And the slower language may be, developing very slowly at the start, but it may gradually pick up pace and it might catch up with the faster language, and it might even overtake the faster language. So in the first 3 years of life, it's very difficult to tell whether the child is going to be receptive or not. And that is why in my study of receptive bilingual children, I only studied the children from the ages of, well, there were 2. One is age 4 and the other one is age 7, because at those ages, it's more clear that the child is much more stronger in one language and is very articulate and is able to express his thoughts and feelings in that particular language, and not doing so in the weaker language. So it's very hard to tell at the beginning, so I only did the study when they're much older, and according to the parents whose children participated in my study, they told me that the children have not been speaking the weaker language ever since they started to speak. So yes, I think they are early receptive bilinguals.
Okay, so if I understand it right, then you can tell from a very early stage, actually, that they are maybe not speaking that language, so that they understand the language but don't reply in that language. But it's better to wait maybe when around age 3, 4, as you said, and in your studies you focus more on older children to really determine, okay, this is now a receptive bilingual, so to
Yes. So, specifically, parents, if you are very concerned about this, and your child is just 2 years old and 3 years old, don't be too worried about, oh, is my child going to be a receptive bilingual? What you do is we all know all bilingual children have a stronger language and a weaker language. And what we can do in those first 3 years is to give as much support and encouragement for the weaker language, talk more and read more and play more in that language. And then naturally, both languages would grow, even if they grow at different speed, but they would both develop. Yeah. So my advice is not to be too worried about that first, but of course, give extra care and attention to the weaker language in the first 3 years of life. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that is the question that we see on display. How do you know whether the weaker language is now just slower to develop, or if it's actually already leading towards a receptive bilingualism?
Okay. So in the first 3 years of life, maybe don't get too panicky and too over worried about receptive bilingualism. Just assume that the weaker language is just slow to develop, and just take extra care and attention. But at older ages, let's just say at the age of 4 and above, it's a bit more clear. And I'm going to explain the findings from my research to give you some idea of what is receptive bilingualism. Okay, so in the children that I've studied, both of them were speaking Japanese to their parents, and their parents were non-Japanese who spoke either English or Italian to the children. Okay, and so what I noticed from my analysis of their audio recordings were that in the stronger language, the two children could produce Japanese very spontaneously. So when I say spontaneously, that means they could express how they feel, and they could give an opinion, and it just comes up to them. They don't need any kind of stimulus from their parents. They just, they see something, they want to say something, they'll just say it, right? And this is not actually seen when they are using their weaker language. So I don't see that spontaneous use of language in their weaker language. And instead, the use of the weaker language is a little bit contrived and a little bit more automated. Okay, so what do I mean by that? That usually in the weaker language is usually limited to things like yes/no responses. For example, the parent would ask questions in English or Italian, and they won't speak English or Italian, but they'll at least say yes or no in their weaker language. And a second feature is that they tend to imitate what their parents said. So, for example, if the parent said something in English or Italian, then they would just repeat that what has been said fully or partially. So it's like an imitation. And the third feature is that what they say in their weaker language tends to be what we call routine-like. So it could be if they're playing a board game and they won't speak the weaker language, but they'll use that to count 1, 2, 3, 4 on the board game, or they might just sing a song in the weaker language. Or if they're playing a game of cards, then they might have a fixed, like a formulaic phrase, a set phrase. Like, for example, if they want a card, an animal card, then they'll say, do you have a zebra? Do you have a monkey? So do you have with an animal name in that? So it's kind of like a formulaic phrase, which they can use. And that's the feature. And for the child whom I studied, I mean, she would say, "Do you have a zebra? Do you have a monkey?" She wouldn't say it spontaneously, like, "Oh, do you have a extra piece of chocolate?" You know, so she wouldn't use it spontaneously, but she'll use it for a game. So that's the feature of the language that they use, in the weaker language. Yeah. So it's very different from the stronger language, where everything is very spontaneous. And also in the stronger language, the child would be asking a lot of questions, yes, spontaneously. But in the weaker language, the child wouldn't be asking questions. Very few questions are asked. And if they were asked, they tend to be what we call clarification requests. So for example, the father might say something like, "Do you have a 6?" You know, like you roll the dice, "Do you have a 6?" And she'll, the child would say 6. So it's a question just to clarify what has been said. Yeah. So it's nothing, nothing very like, what's that? Or, how do you feel? Not questions that actually have much communicative content in it. Yeah. And one more feature, sorry, I'm just going on and on, is that in the stronger language, the receptive bilingual child would initiate a new topic of conversation. Yeah, and I've noticed this in Japanese for the children whom I've studied, because Japanese is their stronger language. So without anything, they would just, bring up a new topic for conversation, but they would very rarely do this in the weaker language. Okay, so you can see the difference between how they use the stronger language, which is so spontaneous and it's complex, and they show their feelings and they share their opinions, versus the weaker language, where they are actually waiting for the parent to say something and just react to it. Yeah, and reacting in a very short responses and in a very limited and very predictable way. So I guess that's the difference between the weaker language use and the stronger language use in the receptive bilingual child.
Yes, because there was something that I was a bit struggling with the term of receptive bilingual, right? Because of course we think it's rather a person who would not be able to speak, to utter anything in the other language, whereas the way now you described it, there is the possibility the child, in this sense, because we're talking about children, is able to say a few words, to have a conversation. Just, it's not elaborated, it's not long sentences, it's maybe a yes or no, like you just said. So that would also be considered already rather a receptive bilingual, or is there a continuum between not uttering words or sentences yet a receptive bilingual and one who can already say a few things? Is there a continuum maybe?
Yeah, I like the way you put it, that is on a continuum, yes. And I've actually given much thought to this, because there is actually no working definition for the term receptive bilingualism in children. But if you think about it, if a child who is normally developing, a normally developing child who hears 2 languages from birth, do you think that child would not be able to say a single word in the weaker language? That, to me, it doesn't make sense, because if he's exposed to the language from the day he was born, by the time that he's 4 or 5, surely he'll be able to say at least yes or no, or, greetings at least. Yeah, at the bare minimum, he would be able to say that, right? And it is actually very difficult. I mean, maybe some people think, so should we put a number on it? Like, say, if 10% of his language is in the weaker, is the weaker language, 10% or lower, should then he be considered as receptive bilingual? And if it's more than 10%, then he's active. I found through my study that it is actually not so easy to do this. Because the younger child, the 4-year-old whom I've studied, when I actually run the numbers, 40% of her speech was actually English. And when I got those preliminary numbers, I was panicking. I was like, no, she's active bilingual. I can't continue with this research. I was like, but when I actually look again at the audio recordings, and I agreed with the parents said that they were receptive. And when I listened to how they interact in the audio recordings, yes, she was talking, but she wasn't actually talking. You know what I mean?
So once again, with other words, we are not speaking quantity here, we are speaking quality.
Yes. And the reason why her figures like 40% was because she doesn't speak much English, but she was very fond of saying no to her father in English. So her terrible twos and the terrible fours were as terrible as the terrible twos, maybe. So she kept on saying no, and that kind of like really upped the numbers. And so that is actually very misleading to consider receptive bilingualism by just looking at the numbers. And that's why I thought, yeah, we got to look at the quality of how they use the language, and that's very important. And the biggest difference that I found was the lack of spontaneity and very limited use of the language. And it always has to be elicited by the parents, and it's never really initiated by the child. So I think, yeah, that's something to start with. I have to say that the research on receptive bilingualism is very limited, and what I do may not be enough, but it could be something that we can build on in the future, and could be a good point of reference for parents. Yes, but don't go on it strictly. It's just a rough guide for parents who are worried about their children who are receptive bilinguals.
Well,
Yes.
I think definitely you hit a point that I think is very important here, where it is a big phenomenon. I think many parents hit this wall, but you say the research is still limited. So this discussion is definitely crucial, I think. But I want to take just a second to acknowledge everybody watching our show right now live on both YouTube and Facebook. Thank you for joining. Thank you. We've got folks from Massachusetts. We've got folks coming in from Okinawa, Japan. So this is definitely an exciting session. So thank you for taking the time. Okay.
Yeah.
Uta?
Yes, I wanted also to reiterate what just Tetsu said, that although maybe the research is not that followed that much or not so broad yet, but it is a very crucial thing for parents. And I find your research and the approach that you have, that you are not only focusing on the child, but on the whole context. How is the communication happening in the family? How is the child responding? How is actually also the parent responding, which would be a question that I would have, but I will ask it later, because we are all a team, right? We need someone who listens to us and who understands what we mean in order to have a conversation, a connection. Right. But I would like to ask you, can you please tell us what can lead to this receptive bilingualism? Because I always suppose, I know it's not always the case, that as parents we want to communicate with our children. We shower them with words, with sentences, with everything that we can in order to get something in response, something out of them. So what can lead to this kind of more receptive bilingualism? You mentioned before we need to give the input. Is there something else that we parents would need to know or be aware of?
Okay, so basically we can think of two main factors that contribute to receptive bilingualism. And the first factor is what you have mentioned, Ut, which is the words, yes, the exposure and the input. So bilingual children need enough exposure so that they can, absorb the input and churn it out into output. Yes, and usually many parents, if they are very dedicated to bilingual parenting, they would have fulfilled this, the first criterion of giving enough exposure to the language. And what they find is that it's baffling that, well, I talk to him from day one, and every day I talk to him, but he only speaks back to me in the other language. Yeah, so that brings us to the second criterion, which is the opportunity for the child to use the language, or the need for the child to speak the language. And actually, so I wouldn't really talk about the exposure part, but I would just really concentrate on the opportunity for the child to speak the language. And that is actually what I found in my study, because in the two families, the parents are actually amazing parents. They are so dedicated and so committed to bilingual parenting. And they do spend a lot of time with the children. They read to the children, and they do a lot of fun activities together, like playing board games and baking and cooking, and send them to, weekend school in the weaker language. So they basically ticked all the boxes. Okay, so that brings us to that one thing, the interaction. Yeah, were the children given the opportunity, or did the children feel the need to speak English or Italian, which were the weaker languages? And the question, and from looking at the audio recordings, I would say not really. Okay, so not really. So what happened here is that, so the parent is speaking the English or Italian, and the children are speaking Japanese back to them. Okay, and so each party is using a different language simultaneously in conversation, and we call this dual lingual interactions. And in my data, the dual lingual interactions go on forever, for the longest time. Like, sometimes if you're not used to it, you find this is really unique, but they do it on a regular basis. Yeah. Parent speaks one language, child speaks the other language. And the reason why this dual lingual interaction keeps going is because every time the child responds in Japanese, the parent accepts that, acknowledges that, and moves on with the conversation. So I would say that one main factor for the receptive bilingualism, if you look at the interactions, is that the parent just moves on. Yes. So when the parent moves on with the conversation, it actually sends a message to the child. Okay, so what is the underlying message when you just move on? The conversation is, oh yeah, I speak my language and you speak your language, and you do your thing and I do my thing, and we communicate, and there's no problem here. And so that is the underlying message, right? So what we need to do is actually to encourage the child to speak. So when the child speaks Japanese, we need to point that out. Hey, why don't you try to speak my language? So that's why it is actually very important to practice conversational strategies to give the children an extra little push to speak the language. If you keep moving on, then of course it's going to be a dual lingual situation where we all just speak our own languages and just carry on with the conversation in different ways.
There is a slight complicating factor there when parents have different languages, and they each speak their own language and understand each other. So they are actually using that dual language strategy. So that's something to keep in mind, that for the child looking at the parents, well, they are doing that, I can do that too. So the need needs to be strong for the child to seize the opportunity and speak.
Yes, that's right. I actually did talk to a parent about that, whose child is not in my study, but he told me that he and his wife were doing dual lingual interactions, and it so happened that the child is also a receptive bilingual, and we were having this discussion on could could the child be looking at how the parents do this duolingual thing, and could that have an influence on how he thought, well, I can do the same thing too? So that is actually a possibility. Yes, Rita, I think so. Although nobody has actually done research on that yet.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, but that's a possibility.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's just for me, it's important to kind of keep in mind that children don't necessarily do this because they don't want to, or they reject your language. So parents shouldn't feel like the child is rejecting their language. It's just that it might well be that this is the situation as the child sees as normal. And then we have to kind of go beyond that and then find ways of creating the need for the child to use the language.
Yes, but regardless of how the the two parents communicate between the parent and the child, the parent can still use conversational strategies to set a new way of communication, which is in the same language. Yes. So if we don't have confidence in that, then of course, we wouldn't even try, right? So because this is how we communicate between husband and wife, and this is how we do it between parent and child. So we still need to give this a go, because it is possible that between parent and child, it could be in the same language. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And what you just said, Rita and Janice, about the conversation or the communication that happens between adults, between the parents, I think the same kind of communication strategies that I will now ask your question about, Janice, in a moment, can happen also between the parents. So if, of course, we have the situation where both parents don't know or can't speak the other parent's language fluently enough to have a proper conversation. But there are also situations where they do have the knowledge, but they're just having these dual lingual conversation among them for obvious reasons. You're quicker, you don't have time, you don't want to think about it in the other language, and you know that the other person is understanding it anyway. So this is, I think, the normal situation in so many multilingual families, in ours as well. We are guilty of that.
Yeah.
But you were talking about discourse strategies, and we had several episodes where Elizabeth Lanza was pointing out the minimal grasp strategy, for example, and also Anik de Houwer did the same in the past episode. What would be, in your opinion, a strategy that is effective in these conversations that we have with our child, and when we know the other language is a weaker one? So we know that maybe the child does not have the words that are necessary, or not actively using the words that would be necessary to continue the conversation in that language. Is there something that you could suggest us?
Okay, all right, yeah. So I think on this show, previously, Professor Elizabeth Lanza, who first introduced this very important concept of conversational strategies, she talked about it, and Professor Anik de Houwer has talked about it, and now I'm going to talk about it again. It's because we do think that it is very important for establishing bilingualism. So, so I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with these strategies. So before I answer your question, Ud, I'm just going to run through it so that everybody's like on the same page and on the same level. Yeah. Okay. So there are basically three strategies which are useful for getting the child to speak more of the weaker language. And the first one is called the minimal grasp strategy. Okay. And let's assume that I'm an English-speaking parent and my child speaks Japanese to me, which is not my language. Okay. So if he says something like "moikai," okay, and I would say like, "Huh? What is it?" Yeah. So just to get him to say that what he said back to me in English. Okay. And this is actually the most effective method for encouraging active production. It has been shown in several studies to be very effective. Okay. But somehow it's a bit controversial because parents are not comfortable with this minimal grasp strategy because it's like pretending that you don't understand. Okay. But I don't look at it that way. It's not that I'm pretending not to understand. The What is it? What's that? That's actually just a prompt, okay? That's actually just a cue for the child to switch to the other language, okay? So that's the minimal grasp strategy. And the second strategy is called the express guess strategy, okay? So in the express guess strategy, maybe the child says, "Moikai," and I'll say like, "One more time?" Yeah, so you're trying to guess what he said in Japanese and say it in English. And the third strategy is called the adult repetition strategy, which is quite similar. So if the child says "moikai," and you go like, "One more time." Yeah. So that's what you do. Okay. So in the receptive bilingual children who I studied, unfortunately, because the conversations were mostly duolingual, that these the move on, they usually just move on. 93% of the time it's all move on, and only in like 4%, yeah, in 4% of those exchanges were these conversational strategies used. And when they were used, they did not really get a response from the children. Okay, all right. So very unfortunately, in the very small percentage in which they were used, they didn't get a good response. So I analyzed that, and I think that there are some ways you can fine-tune those conversational strategies so that they actually become effective. Okay, so I'm just going to go through some tips on how to make them effective. Okay, all right. Now, in my data, I realized that parents may not always wait for the child to respond. Okay, so for example, the child says "moikai," and you go like, "One more time? One more time? Is that what you want? Okay, let's do it again." So you just rush through it. You say it, but then you just continue with the conversation. So if you actually use it intentionally with the intention of your child responding, then pause and wait. So if he says "moikai," you go like, "One more time?" And there's no response. "One more time?" Until you get a response. Yeah. Okay. I would even go one step further, and if I don't get a response, like, "One more time. Can you say that, please?" I would even explicitly make that request for the child to respond. So that's one tip, which I found that in my data that the parents tend to rush through, and that didn't help to get them talking in the weaker language. And the second one is you can also try to combine the strategies to get a response. Okay, so some parents may be worried that, oh, the minimal grasp strategy where I just pretend. I mean, what if the child doesn't know what to say? I mean, especially if they're just like 1.5 years old, right? I can't really use the minimal grasp strategy, right? Okay, so you can actually combine two strategies together to get maybe a response. So here's how you do it. So child says "moikai," and then you go like, "Huh? What? One more time? One more time?" And then, "Okay, let's do this again." So you can actually combine two strategies and get it to work to your favor. And the third one, which I realized from the receptive bilingual children whom I've studied, is that because they only they're not really familiar with conversational strategies, they are hardly used. And because they are hardly used, especially with the younger 4-year-old child whom I've studied, is that she doesn't actually understand that it was a cue for her to switch to English. Okay, so my third tip for you is that you need to make sure that the child understands your intention. Okay, so what happened in my study is that the child. So let's just assume this is something similar from my study. The child would say "moikai," and then the father would say "one more time," and the child would just say means yes in Japanese. So she doesn't take it as a cue for her to change her to Japanese to English. She just takes it as a real question. Like he wanted to just confirm what she just said. Okay. So at the very beginning, if you start using conversational strategies, maybe your child doesn't really understand what you're trying to do there. So you have to be a bit more clear. Like for instance, you might say it like moikai, and then you go like one more time. Can you say that in English? Yes, can you say one more time? So maybe just to get the child to be more familiar with your conversational strategies. I do that with my son all the time when he was 2 or 3 years old. And by the time he was 5, 6, or 7, whenever I use the adult repetition strategy, and whenever I say it, he would just repeat that automatically without me asking him, to repeat that. So it's all about socializing and getting the child to be very familiar with what you're trying to do, and and then they will understand, and then hopefully they will oblige. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I thank you very much for this long explanation. And I would like to point out one thing. We did the same with this adult strategy, actually, with our children when they were about 10 years old, and it worked like a charm. Mm-hmm. And we also did it with my husband. So we repeated the same kind of strategy among us adults, and also in the broader family. When we are all together, we have like 4 or 5 languages, and it helped to make sure that grandpa or grandma or the aunt or the cousin would chime in with the right language, although they knew we understand, but we had a dinner in that given language, and it worked quite well. But I think one very important thing in these strategies is actually they interrupt the flow. Yeah, and it can be perceived sometimes as disturbing in the flow, because you want to talk, especially if you want to get your message across very quickly, like many people do. I do as well, and children as well. But I think there is a trick to interrupt the conversation, but take it as a moment to take a breath and to concentrate or focus on what is going on, and then make sure that the strategy is effective by letting the child a little bit more time to switch. Maybe not for the first turn, the second turn, the third turn. Maybe it's after 2-3 turns that the child switches to the desired language.
There's a question on this very topic here from Shema Gadr, and the comment is, I'm afraid that when insisting that my kid speaks the weaker language, he would just stop talking to me in any language. So what do we say to that?
I guess you got to choose your battles, and you can't be using it all the time, because yes, it will cause a communicative breakdown. Yes, if you do it all the time. So what we actually advise is that if you start from young, you start using these conversational strategies from young, they will understand. And what happened in a few research studies is that it's actually used very intensively right at the beginning. But once the children start speaking, they already understand that they're supposed to speak this language, and therefore you don't actually use it all the time. You get what I mean? But however, children, whenever they go through a big transition in their lives, like going to preschool or starting elementary school, then the stronger language gets even stronger. And at that time, these conversational strategies become very important. So in the question by Sharma, I think that there are times when you can do this, and there are times when you cannot do this. So you have to find a balance between those two things, right? The way the children use the language is actually very different. Like, for example, where my son, when he was an elementary school student, the minute he walks in through the door right after school, it's quite difficult to use these conversational strategies because he just came home from school and his mind is in the school language. All right, so I wouldn't do it immediately. I wouldn't do it immediately. But when you're settled down and he's quite settled, you got to read his moods, yeah, and then you can start using it. So you got to pick your timing, especially when he's at an older age where he can be quite resistant. So you got to pick your timing. But I would say that the conversational strategies would definitely work when you have more bargaining power. So if he wants dessert, he has to say it in the weaker language, whether he likes it or not. In those situations, it's non-negotiable, okay? You can do the conversational strategies and it should work, or otherwise, there's no dessert.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, perfect. Thank you for that, Janice. There's another question here, because children are different. What works for one child doesn't necessarily work for the other. So Pippa asks about her grandchildren who are different personalities. The older one is shy and the younger one is not so shy, and the older one prefers or doesn't speak that readily.
Yeah, yes. Well, from my experience, I do think that the personality of the child does really matter. Although there is actually very little work or very little research that has been done in this area as well. Okay, not from my study, but also from other studies, you can see that some children are just very open to speaking the languages if they are eager to please the adults, which I guess from Pippa here, the younger granddaughter might be, very eager to please the adults and therefore speaks the language. But the grandson could be very shy and maybe a bit reluctant. Yeah. So I guess it's really hard in those instances, and the personality do come into play.
And basically, parents just have to adjust their strategy according to the child. What works with a 5-year-old will probably not work with an 8-year-old. So we need to adjust accordingly. It's like always, there is no one size fits all in this. I mean, one thing when we speak about strategies, but we must not forget, and I always bring this up, we can speak to our children, explain to them how important the language is and why we want them to speak. And we can do this from they're quite small. We shouldn't just look at the child from the top and this is a strategy I use on you, but they are our partners, and we can show our feelings and our passion for the language and explain it that way. I think that is so important, and that message sometimes gets lost in all the strategies. So.
Yeah. Yes. So yes, when they're older, actually, they will be able to understand more and how important that language is to you. But sometimes they'll use it to their favor. Like I know that some receptive bilingual children, they won't speak the language, but when the parents are angry with them, they would just speak it so that it pleases them. So they do use the language very selectively to their advantage at times. Yeah.
And some parents find that when they all of a sudden speak to someone who doesn't speak another language, then it comes, but they won't do it with you. So that's also some things to look into. I've had cases like that where the child speaks with someone else, but not with the parent, and it turned out that the child was afraid of making mistakes in front of the parent. And once they had that discussion, then it kind of the knots loosened and the child was able to start to speak.
Yes, I also saw that I also have that kind of experience with my 2 subjects in my study. When they go back to Italy, the child was apparently, according to the parent, that he was speaking a little bit more Italian to the Italian grandparents, but not to the parent. And apparently it's because they were already so used to this duolingual interactions that it, at the age of 7, you've been doing it for a really long time, and it just became a real bit awkward to actually speak the language to the father when it's actually quite natural to speak a little bit more of that to the grandparents. Yeah, but he wasn't really speaking too much though, apparently, but a little bit more than to his father. Yeah.
Yes. And that reminds me of a friend who for 10 years was talking Italian to his daughter, who was always replying in other languages, in Dutch and in Portuguese, which was the language of his wife, is the language of his wife. And it was actually after a holiday in Italy with grandparents and with cousins that the daughter then made the switch or the shift to then also Italian with his father after they came back here to the Netherlands. So it can also be that, I mean, every child is different. Everyone needs another kind of trigger or incentive to speak or to act, whatever, in the other language. So for this child, it was actually what you just explained from your research, a holiday spent immersed into the language and with speaking it with different people, with different registers, actually, and that worked. I like that we are now focusing on the agency of the child's agency that was also mentioned in this broadcast from Mila Schwartz a few episodes ago. You said that these strategies or the negotiating factor is rather used maybe with older children, not maybe with 1-year-old or 2-year-olds, but when the children are older. Can you tell us more about the negotiating factor and the child's agency in determining the language choice? So how can we invite our children to have a say?
Well, as parents, we know that children grow increasingly more assertive, right? And expressing their opinions about how things should be done as they grow older. But there is a big range. Yeah, some children are more assertive even from a very young age, and some children are more obliging even at older ages. So I guess that's also related to personality, and that's why we see a big range of differences in how bilingualism, works in different children, just like in Pipa's question earlier. But in general, of course, in general, most children would be increasingly more assertive as they grow older. I think that's a general trend that maybe everyone can agree on. And what happens is that I've talked about parents' conversational strategies, right? Okay. But children will also use conversational strategies to get you to speak their stronger language when they get older. It's scary. So please use those conversational strategies before they are used on you, okay? So how do children use these strategies is that maybe the parent will say something in the weaker language, yes? And they would just say, oh, I don't understand what you're saying. Can you say that in Japanese, please? They'll say, oh, it's too difficult for me. I don't understand. So can you say that, please? So they have their own conversational strategies to counter your conversational strategies. But theirs are actually quite, you have to be very careful because their conversational strategies are intended for the parent to use the stronger language. So you must never fall for that, because if you switch to their stronger language, they will not only not speak the language, they will stop hearing it, right? They'll hear less of it. And when that happens, it could slowly lead the child to monolingualism, not even receptive bilingualism. So you got to look out for that as the child gets older. And I guess it's a battle between parent and child. It's like, who wins? Yeah.
Yes, don't show them this broadcast.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. only intended for parents only.
Yeah, I must say my children do that. They do that, and I did it as well. So, but in certain circumstances. So when we were out and about and the context was the more dominant language, this is when I purposely ignored what my parents would say in German in order to fit in, to blend into the community language. But I think this is another situation. We are talking about how to manage these languages within the family at home, right? So I think there are societal situations where we can follow our children and where it wouldn't be any harm if we continue speaking then the most dominant language with them, because it makes us understood by the group or by the context.
Yes.
But this leads me now to another kind of question that we have plenty of questions, I must say. Are there different kind of receptive bilinguals, or can one become also a receptive bilingual later in life? We were talking about children. How is it later in life if a child maybe is already 7 or 10 or 15 or 20?
Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. So receptive bilingualism can happen at any point in time in our lives. It happens in adulthood, right? So, for example, I spoke fluent Mandarin before, but now I've almost lost it. So I'm also a case of receptive bilingualism. Receptive bilingualism can happen to anyone at any point in time in their lives, but specifically referring to children, it actually a lot of receptive bilinguals start off by speaking both languages, but they slowly become receptive bilinguals, and that usually happen at the major transitions into daycare, nursery, preschool, or elementary school, and even later on in junior high school or high school. So it can happen there then at those important points in time, because the stronger language just gets stronger. Yes, and in when they become teenagers, peer influence is just so strong that they hardly speak to your parents anymore, except for some, really, really simple, basic conversations. Yeah, so those are the times where you have to be very careful. Okay, so they're very susceptible to receptive bilingualism at those points in time. And what you do, well, you really need to give extra care and attention right after they, start school, and be very mindful of what language they're actually saying. So mindfulness is, a very popular word these times. We talk about mindful eating, right? Yeah, and so that's why it's necessary for parents to be mindful of how much of the weaker language that they are actually speaking, because before you know it, if you don't pay attention, you'll find that one day at the dinner table that the whole conversation is actually in the stronger language only, right? So definitely be vigilant and be very mindful of how much they are actually producing in the weaker language.
Yes, and so I understand that if then a language has become a little bit weaker for the child, we can direct them to become more balanced bilinguals, or to increase their fluency in the weaker language in order to become more fluent in it, whatever this means.
Yes. And well, the quickest and the easiest fix for those lapsed in language use is usually the trip back home. Okay. But unfortunately, that trick doesn't work in our pandemic world right now. Yeah. Okay. So what we can do is probably to spend more time with the child. Yeah. So maybe like a one-to-one date to the zoo, if he's still fairly young, or even to a meal at the restaurant, just one-to-one, speaking the weaker languages. Just try to do things with the child on a one-to-one basis, and where you just give your full attention, and there's a lot of interaction in that language.
And one thing that I know has worked in quite a few families, it needs to be a slightly younger child, not a teenager, but if you introduce a toy which is monolingual in that language. So the toy does not understand anything else than that one language. That can be very effective, because that is totally understandable for a small child. They accept that, and if you go with it and play the translator between the toy and your child, and then so what do you want to say to the toy? Then okay, try to say it, and if the child uses the wrong language, the toy just shakes head. I don't understand.
Yeah.
You can't do that because you would be lying, but the toy can do it.
Yes.
It's amazing.
There's one person, one language expanded to
Yeah.
One
toy, one language.
Yes. Well, actually, what you said, Rita, is actually correct. There's actually been a study on that where the child was speaking very little of the weaker language, and the parent actually introduced a puppet that only spoke the weaker language. So yes, that works actually.
And talking about children, I mean, we were talking about, maybe we had only one child in our mind when talking about this, but what about siblings? Is there, is it more likely that maybe younger siblings become receptive bilinguals, or is there a difference in how old the siblings are, if the older one are having this tendency, or the younger ones, in your research and experience?
Well, both of the children who are in my study are actually the second siblings. They are the later borns, yeah. But I don't think we can still generalize this, because, the research is still very, very limited in this area. But I wouldn't say for sure the second child is going to be receptive. I don't want to make anyone panic here, okay? But the younger sibling is perhaps has a higher risk of becoming a receptive bilingual, because primarily because the older child, assuming that he goes to school, he would be speaking more of the school language. And when he comes home from school, he would bring the school language back to the home and speak a lot of it. And when he starts doing that, the mother also speaks more of the stronger language. And of course, the younger sibling also hears more of the stronger language as well. Okay, so the process happens in the first child, whose strong language is getting stronger, and he spreads that to the mother or the father and also the younger sibling. So there's a risk there as well. And also in my study of Southeast Asian mothers in Japan, the younger siblings tend to be receptive bilinguals, because with the first child, it was much easier to bring them home to Thailand, for example, every 6 months or every year. But with the second child, it becomes more expensive so they kind of limit it to once every 2 years. And also because the older child goes to school, and so they only travel during the peak period, which then makes it even more expensive. So it's kind of difficult to keep going back to the home country to get the exposure that they need to the weaker language. And also because of what's happening in the home with the older sibling, giving more exposure to the stronger language, yeah.
Yeah, wouldn't that be a good way to involve the older siblings and make the older sibling somehow responsible to help mommy or daddy to transmit the weaker or the minoritized or minority language in that case?
Yes, actually it would be very effective, especially in an OPOL situation, because then it wouldn't be OPOL, it'd be like one parent, one sibling, giving the language input to the child. Yeah. So I've worked with like many intercultural families in Japan, but unfortunately, in many families, the siblings tend to speak Japanese to each other, even if they speak English to the parent. But in the families who have successfully made the weaker language the medium of communication between siblings, it really helped, and their weaker languages, the minority language, actually very, very strong when the siblings speak to each other in that language. And I think in those families, I see that the parent is quite strict, not strict, but firm about sibling language use. So it's something that you really have to work on right from the start and be very firm about it. So it definitely, if you can get that done, that would be really, really good for the bilingual development of the children. If the
we do have to add that the likelihood is that you do not succeed, because especially if both children go to school in the stronger language, it is really hard to try to maintain. And they might do it when you are in earshot, but as soon as you don't know what they are speaking, they will switch to the dominant language. So yeah, I mean, some positive reinforcement incentives maybe, but yeah, it's not an easy thing to do. So nobody should feel deflated if they don't manage.
No, definitely. But really, kudos to those who could do it. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, sometimes it helps until the older sibling then attends school or becomes a teenager. Then these things tend to slightly shift. And also in multilingual families where you have maybe two different languages in the home, and then the third or fourth language outside of home in the community and at school, it becomes even increasingly more difficult to maintain these languages at home and then decide. The children will always decide for themselves what kind of language, which one of the parents' languages they prefer speaking with each other. And very often, like Rita said, the choice is then the school language. They would use the school language among them. But let's not focus on that for a moment. That would be a topic for another episode, I think. Yes. Janice, could you maybe share with us the suggestions that you could have for parents who think they have receptive bilingual children?
Okay, all right. Okay, so the first thing is, of course, try those conversational strategies. And if they don't work, or they're not, they may not work sometimes, please look at the tips that I've given you earlier, like waiting for the child to respond, or trying two different strategies and combining them, or making sure that the child understands that what you actually want them to do. If they're very young. And of course, choose when you want to use them. They're most effective when you have the most bargaining power, like I said. So in those situations, they would probably work. Yeah. Okay. And another thing is, this option is not available to all of us right now, but it's the trip back home. Okay. And what I learned from my experience in doing this research is that the trip back home actually didn't work very well for my subjects. They remained receptive bilinguals even though they returned from a trip to the US or to Italy. So
how long did they stay?
They went back like every 6 months, or they were there for a couple of weeks, but I had all that data down. And previously, before my study, there were successful case studies of children who went home and became active bilinguals after they've returned home. So what is the difference, and how can we maximize the effectiveness of these trips back home? Okay, so I would recommend that the trip back home should be a full immersive experience for the child, where the child is completely immersed in that language and has no access to the stronger language. Yes. So this insight actually came from the parent of the child whom I was studying, because he said they have never returned to Italy for the first 5 years of the child's life. And when they took the first trip and the second trip much later on, they went home as a family. And so the Japanese-speaking mother was also with them on the trip. And it was in the summer, and so they brought the Japanese summer school homework with them on that trip in Italy. So what happened was that it was not a full immersive experience. The child was speaking Japanese to the mother and doing his Japanese school homework. So he realized that it wasn't very effective. And from there on, he took him back on a one-to-one basis. Like they just went back, father and son. And so it was full Italian experience. But even then, 2 months after that full immersive experience, they came back and was watching the recordings, and they still went back to the same routine. So I think two important things are at play here. The first thing is make sure that it's a full immersive experience for the child. Okay, and this may not include excluding your spouse from the holiday. Maybe he or she can come back. I know, with my husband, it's like he'll spend the first leg of trip with us and he'll go back to Japan early, something like that. So make it a full immersive experience. And the second thing is to follow up with that trip back home with what you do back in your own home. Okay, so the trip back home isn't a magic pill that can make your child speak the language. Yeah, it might encourage more production, but on the plane back, you have to kind of have the some kind of motivation or determination to kind of change the way you and the child talk to each other. Because if that doesn't happen, then of course things just go back to normal, which it did for the child in my study.
I think a good idea in that case is to speak about the experience often. So speak about what you did, and so the child will have the vocabulary, will have the memories, and will have the memory of the language freshly in mind.
Yes, and maybe some videos of those trips that might help to replay and
videos, or even create an album. I know it sounds very old-fashioned, but even create a book with pictures from the trips that you can read through and kind of remember it all.
Yeah. Or maybe even record him or her talking with the grandparents on the trip in that language. And and when you come back, you could play that and say, "Hey, you're speaking the language, and let's speak it," or something like that. Might help. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you very, very much, Janice, for this incredibly inspiring interview that we had today. I wonder, do we have any question from the followers?
We have some questions, but they're not directly related to this topic. We will answer them. We will get back in the comments and answer them. But I think we're fine with regards to those there.
Yeah, we have gone over a little bit. We do apologize to the viewers, but I did not dare jump in and do my typical party pooper thing today. This was so interesting, and every minute was enjoyable. And it's jam-packed with information and tips, and I'm sure lots of viewers, myself included, I'm going to go back in and go through this session again and again and probably again. This is absolutely fascinating.
But don't show it to your kids.
Oh yeah. Like PG-18, something like that.
But thank you. Was there a final sort of an encouragement message to the parents? You did mention how to, what recommendations you have for the parents, but overall, is this okay as a wrap-up message from Janice?
Okay, all right. Well, I just want to say that receptive bilingualism is just very normal. So don't feel too upset if your child is not speaking the language. Try the ideas that I've given today and see whether it works. But really look at bilingualism as a really long-term kind of thing. I know of monolingual young adults who didn't learn the language, but they sign up for language classes in college and start asking their parents to teach them the language. So really, really look at it in the long run. And receptive bilingualism is still bilingualism. Okay, so as long as it's bilingualism and they understand you, you're still communicating. So so hang in there and keep doing it and don't lose hope. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the viewers. I'm glad that we had this fantastic session with Janice today. Next week, the next session, we will sort of take a step back and sort of sort of consolidate everything with peers. So I will put up this next session's. Oh, hang on. Next session. Let me just put.
Okay, he will soon find the right button. Just wait a moment. There he goes.
There you go. I'm not used to this yet. So we will have a parent session that Uta is going to. Was this Uta or is this Rita who's going to talk about this one?
I'll take this. Uta has been speaking so much today.
Thank you.
So in 2 weeks on March the 2nd, and it will then be at our usual time, which is 1 p.m. New York, 6 p.m. London, and 7 p.m. Paris. We will speaking about families on the move. So what do you do when you move from one country to another and from between different languages, maybe school languages different, and so what do we will speak with two parents who have experience of this, Mariam Ottimofiore and Claudia Landini. They have both moved across the world with their kids in tow, and it will be highly interesting to hear their views, and we welcome questions on this topic.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Professor Nakamura. And thank you for everybody who's watching around the world. It's pretty late in some areas. So at this irregular time, thank you very much. We will be coming back to the normal hours on March 2nd, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. in the UK, and 7 p.m. Paris. All right. Thank you. We'll talk to you again next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.